Thank you, Hudson, and let me add my welcome to you all. What is this afternoon, my time in Singapore, this morning in the UK. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're dialing in from in the world. Many thanks for joining us this afternoon. As I said, my name is Russell Marsh. I'm an associate partner at EY, and I'm the green finance lead for what is called the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Programme, which is a programme of the UK government working to promote low carbon energy across the ASEAN region. And here's the agenda for this afternoon's session. In a moment, we'll hear a message from Her Excellency Cara Owen, who's the British High Commissioner to Singapore. And then we will get into the main part of this afternoon's discussion. We will hear first from Sue Phillips of Gender Tech Enterprises, who was the driving force and the lead author of the report that forms the basis of today's discussion. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with three different people from the voluntary carbon market ecosystem to give their views on both what the report found and what they see needs to happen in the voluntary carbon market going forward. And then at the end we have time for some Q&A. So please do post any of your questions that you have for any of the speakers in the chat box on the WebEx platform. You will only be able to ask questions via the chat box, but please don't wait until we get to the Q&A part of the session. To do that, please post your questions whenever they come to mind, and we will then answer them when we get to the Q&A section of the webinar. So very quickly, just a little bit of a description about the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Programme, which is a programme of the UK government led by EY and its partners that include DT Global, who we're working with very closely on this report. You can see from the slide that we have two key pillars for the programme. One is focusing on green finance, one is focusing on energy efficiency. We're working across all of the ASEAN member states, and importantly for this discussion in particular, has a very strong gender and inclusion focus. All the activities we do have an element of gender inclusion within them, and as you will find out in a moment and through the discussion, we have also developed and delivered specific gender activities, of which this is one. So going to after that brief introduction, we're now going to hear from Cara Owen, who's the British High Commissioner to Singapore. As I said, this programme is a programme led and funded by the UK government. So we're going to hear a recorded message from Cara Owen.
I am delighted to be able to open this launch for the new UK-funded report, Integrating a Gender Lens in Voluntary Carbon Markets. This report marks the third in a series of gender and climate finance reports from the UK's ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Programme. This is a 15 million three-year development programme aiming to facilitate sustainable finance flows and improve energy efficiency measures in the ASEAN region. Over its 3 years of implementation, the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Programme has been a pioneer in challenging the existing approaches to gender integration in climate finance for the betterment of both people and planet. These flagship reports have served as conversation and action catalysts. They've contributed towards a gender and climate investing toolkit, recently published and used by investors and corporates globally, as well as feeding into the Sustainable Bond Issuance Guidance published by the Thai Securities and Exchange Commission last year. This was the first of its kind in ASEAN to focus on the why and how bond issuers can integrate climate and gender equality considerations. This latest report focuses on integrating a gender perspective into voluntary carbon markets. Voluntary carbon markets have the potential to safeguard our environment while also enabling investment into decarbonisation transition. It's vital that these gains should work for women and men. The role of women in tackling climate change is central, crucial and indispensable. Women continue to bear a disproportionate burden from the adverse impacts of climate change. And despite progress in recent years, we have seen that women are still so often kept on the sidelines, not only of climate negotiations, but in the design and delivery of climate action. At COP27 just a few weeks ago, the BBC found that less than a third negotiators were female. This is despite the vital role that many of them play in climate adaptation and mitigation. Just last week, I read an interesting article in the New York Times about Sue Biniaz, the US Deputy Envoy for Climate Change, and her contributions to successive COPs, and how she's often relied upon to find the right words or phrase that can allow leaders to break through loggerheads in search of a climate deal. This example is just the tip of the iceberg. There's significant evidence to show that the direct and intentional inclusion of women and girls into climate initiatives can help improve project sustainability and deliver better climate outcomes. On the flip side, we also see that in gender unequal societies, unequal power relations and stereotypes can often be self-reinforcing, resulting in lost opportunities for better project and climate outcomes. So the deliberate adoption of a gender lens can help break this vicious cycle. One of the achievements of COP26 in Glasgow last year was the finalisation of the rulebook for Article 6, which covers the rules for the global carbon market. This took 6 years to finalise and has been described by some as one of the most complicated issues at COP26. Behind this amazing achievement lies the contribution of another woman, Singapore's Minister for Sustainability and the Environment, Grace Fu, who was one of the co-facilitators for the Article 6 negotiations. Since then, there's been an exponential growth in the size and scale of voluntary carbon market sector, with the ASEAN region a large contributor to it. At the same time, there's been a push for higher integrity in the voluntary carbon markets, including a push for stronger social and environmental protections, and for the design of carbon mitigation programs to deliver benefits for local communities. Voluntary carbon markets offer significant opportunities to bring much needed finance to women climate entrepreneurs and to women's organisations working to protect and restore degraded ecosystems and adapt to climate change. But to realise the benefits that voluntary carbon markets bring to the environment and to communities, and to ensure that we maximise the impacts of these benefits, the development of voluntary carbon markets has to be done in an inclusive way. And this is the genesis behind today's session and report. You may not have the magical touch of Sue Biniaz, that ability to find the right word or phrase at just the right time, or the resilience and negotiating ability of Minister Grace Fu to encourage discussion and identify common ground. But there are things that each and every one of us can do. I hope that this pioneering report will stimulate action across the voluntary carbon market ecosystem. It provides evidence, examples of best practice, and proposes a set of practical recommendations for integrating a gender lens into voluntary carbon market development. I'm really sorry that I can't join you today, but I look forward to hearing all about the discussions that are going to take place. I hope you get lots out of it. Thank you.
So obviously, many thanks to Cara for those opening remarks and for her support of the program overall over its over the last few years. We're now going to move relatively quickly into the next part of the presentation, which is going to be from Sue Phillips. So excuse me, Tut, I'm having trouble with the there we go. Sorry, I was having trouble with the slide. Sorry. We're going to be very quickly into the main part of the presentation today. But before we did that, I just wanted to do two things. Firstly, just highlight the reports that Cara outlined. As I said at the beginning, this is one of 3 reports and pieces of work we've done that have been focusing specifically on on gender as it relates to elements of climate and climate finance. And you can see here that those 3 reports again, and it's the one on the right that we're talking about today. The other thing I wanted to do before I introduced Sue is we have wanted to ask the audience a question, and we have a couple of these polls throughout today's session. It's always helpful for us to get some interaction from the audience, check you're listening, but also to get a sense of your views on some of these issues. So if I could ask Hudson to launch the first poll, you should see that question appear on the right hand side of your screen, and you have 4 answers. Please click the answer that most represents the part of the market you work in, and then click submit. And then whilst we will show you the answers in terms of in aggregate, we won't be sort of indicating who answered what to which question. And we have a couple of other polls throughout this session today. And I'll just repeat something else I said earlier, which is say, please do use the chat box throughout this session to ask questions of any of the speakers and panelists that are presenting today. We will pick up the questions that we get, and we will answer them at the Q&A session at the end of today. So we leave this poll running for about another couple of seconds, and we will see the answers flash up. So you can see there, again, where a lot of the participants come from, a good spread throughout the ecosystem, which is great to see that interest from across the ecosystem. And again, please do feel free to ask questions of anyone on this call as we go through the session. So we're now going to move to presentation on the report, its key findings. We're going to hear from Sue Phillips. So Sue's the lead author, and she's from Gender Tech Enterprises, and Sue will now take us through the key findings and recommendations of the report. I mean, Sue has a long career as a gender and social inclusion specialist in the public and private sectors. She's led Social Development Direct for over 20 years, and a leading consultancy in the international development sector. I won't go through all of her CV. I'm sure Sue is known to many of you. I've certainly enjoyed working with her over the course of this program. She's certainly increased my knowledge and understanding of this issue, and our thanks to her for the work she's put in both on this report and for the work of the program more broadly. So Sue, over to you to give your report, to talk about the summary of the report findings and the recommendations.
Thank you, Russell, and morning, afternoon, everyone. As introduced, as Sue Phillips, I had the privilege, I guess, of leading this piece of work, working with a great team who are also with us here today, particularly Olivia Jenkins, Smita Biswas, and Suzanne Woodhouse. And so what I am doing here is just running through the highlights of the report. There are 3 volumes of the report, which you should have links to with the invitation. A key summary, an executive summary, a main report for those who want to go deeper, and a 3rd volume, which has got full of resources as well for those that really want to get stuck in. So here we've highlighted 5 key findings, and I think the first message really, based on quite a substantive desk review, research, and Cara Owen, I think, highlighted already the strong evidence that exists, both in terms of social justice case, a business case, impact case, and indeed a policy case for getting women involved in climate action. Empowering women can improve climate outcomes for all. The part of this slide, which is, and it's time to catch up, relates to the fact that we found from our research that the voluntary carbon markets were behind the wider climate sector and certainly the wider international development space. So that's the first key finding. As I said, lots of information in the report for those who really want to dig down deeper into the evidence that supports this finding. A second finding is that women are really not well represented in the sector at any level. And so for a real change, a sort of significant, meaningful change to take place, that really needs a step change and opening the door widely to women. And that's vital to the success of the voluntary carbon markets. There are massive gaps in the flow of finance to women engaged in climate stewardship. We see an underrepresentation of women in management and leadership roles across the sector, but particularly on the ground in the global South and East. Women not benefiting equally from projects, mitigation activities that generate carbon credits, financially and otherwise. So the message here is it's not about tinkering with the carbon market to mainstream, as we say, gender and women's empowerment, but to really bring women's voices centrally into the voluntary carbon markets at every level. Moving on to the third key finding, we interviewed, as well as desk research, we did a number of interviews with key stakeholders across the voluntary carbon market ecosystem, and received a consistent message about the importance of buyers of carbon credits, who are key to driving demand for carbon credits that integrate considerations around women and gender. And the message that we picked up that there is growing buyer interest for higher integrity carbon credits that include clear delivery of benefits for women, as well as doing no harm. But that is quite a mixed picture at the moment. And whilst it's quite a niche demand that and the wider market doesn't yet have a real sense of why including women, including a gender perspective in the carbon markets really matters. Moving on to the fourth finding, this is around crediting programs. Well, for crediting programs obviously have a major role to play in market governance, and the approval, if you like, the verification, the validation, verification that a project generating carbon credits are genuine, and part of that process is integrating gender. And what we see is quite a wide variety across the current crediting programs, from the best in class, such as Gold Standard, to other standards such as Vera, who incorporate gender in some of their more add-on standards, such as the SD Vista and CCB, Climate Community Biodiversity. Won't get too techie here because I don't want to leave people behind or get into too much detail. But there's some standards who appreciate the importance of gender and have integrated that into some of their standards. But across the piece, there are others who haven't. In fact, in some parts of the market, there is no reference to the importance of women or requirements to include any consideration of women, and that's something that really needs to change. And the fifth finding, so at the moment, over the last few years, there have been some important global initiatives that have been ongoing, such as the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, the ICVCM, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, VCMI, and these are very important in terms of establishing the global governance going forward. So it's key that those two bodies play a really important role in setting the standards for across the market, which is why, as part of this study, we've been engaging actively with both of those bodies to see gender integrated. If we could move on, please, to the next slide, we'll come to some of the recommendations. This slide summarizes the 5 key recommendations, which are grouped together into areas. And the way we've put at the heart of this, if you like, the first recommendation, which will go on to discuss each of these in turn, but this democratization of the voluntary carbon market and creating access for women to voluntary carbon markets. We put that at the heart of our recommendations as a central recommendation that underpins all others. And this is about bringing women's voices, bringing their experiences, and bringing them, ensuring that they are more actively and equally engaged in the voluntary carbon markets. And around that, we have 4 recommendations. 1, building market awareness, because clearly there is a limited awareness at the moment of the importance and value of gender to success of the voluntary carbon markets. On the other hand, building buyer demand, again, niche interest, but again, limited awareness of the value and importance of integrating a gender perspective. And then we talk about looking at embedding in global governance, as well as embedding the gender into the policy frameworks that are emerging at national level. So let's move then quickly to looking at those in more depth. If I could have the next slide, please. So yes, to expand on the democratizing and creating access for women, what's how do we bring women much more centrally into the voluntary carbon market and tap into the potential that they offer? So we have a series of more detailed recommendations here. The first around actually increasing women's awareness, particularly on the ground of the voluntary carbon markets. What is it? How can they engage with it? And to do that, we can't just expect that to happen. It will require some targeted action and some targeted materials and support to really actively work with women on the ground to get them more involved as project developers, as project owners, or indeed just being more engaged and participating equally in initiatives on the ground. Finance, big issue. So start with looking at benefit sharing arrangements and building more equity and transparency into those. Where is the money flowing? How much of it is flowing to women? Building the capacity of those organizations that are on the ground, closer to women on the ground, who can support and assist women entrepreneurs, women's organizations and others to get involved in the market. They need capacity building because they too, most of them, have limited understanding and experience, so they too need support. One of the issues around women-led activities are that they're often small scale, and the carbon markets need large scale. So one of the things that we recommend that is looked at is looking at how those women-led initiatives can be linked to larger initiatives so that they don't miss out because they can't meet the required criteria for access to those markets. And fifthly, increasing the scale and flow of accessible finance. So I think in our report, we quote quite a few figures on that highlight the lack of finance at this level. The one that stands out most in my mind is the UNDP 2016 figure, which is 0.01% of climate finance going to climate change and women's rights organization. I think that gives a good sense of the massive gap in finance and the need to not just get money down to women's organizations and women's entrepreneurs on the ground, but to make that finance accessible. That is a constraint, and one that needs to be looked at to see how finance can actually get to women and change the way in which it's delivered to suit women's needs, to get more women able to access and tap into that finance. I think we better swiftly move on to recommendation 2 around building market awareness. As I said, what we see and have found from the report is that there is quite limited awareness of the importance of and value of incorporating gender into the voluntary carbon market. So one of our first recommendations is to form a cross-market technical advisory group from across the ecosystem, and there are many women and men too that are out there who are working on bringing stronger gender perspective into the markets. And we suggest that perhaps led by ICVCM or another cross-market player to bring together a group of experts to work and advise the market more widely, to borrow from the rich resources that are already out there in the wider gender and climate space. And we, in our volume 3, we set out a number of those resources that are already out there. What we found, it's really important to create easy market access to guidance, best practice, materials and examples, because would appear to be growing interest, but people who we interviewed would say, but what we need is the how, to help project developers, to help crediting programs to guide and provide support. So getting those resources together could be a key and important contributor to embedding gender more effectively in the market. There's a body of work done around gender lens investing and women-focused standard setting that could be used to differentiate carbon credits that really do meaningfully contribute to make a meaningful contribution to gender equality. And again, the report gives some good examples of that. We've found that, I think I didn't mention this earlier, that with the buyers, one of the considerations that was a concern that came up was not where buyers were interested in purchasing carbon credits that have integrated gender, that do also deliver benefits for women. It's difficult to identify them, and they're not convinced either by some of the tagging that goes on that exists in the market. So a call for stronger differentiation, stronger methodologies to enable them to identify those. Let's quickly run through the final ones. So building a demand for carbon credits with a women's empowerment and gender equality focus. Build a buzz. This recommendation came not surprisingly from a marketing person. Right, really what we need is to get a lot of interest and engagement in the market. Maybe form a high profile buyers club of those that are interested in showing leadership in this space and on demonstrating why gender is important to them. Leveraging VCMI's role, working on the demand side with corporates, getting them actively engaged in promoting and explaining to their constituents why gender matters. But in this area, getting a bit more of a detailed understanding of what are the how to channel investment into this area, and understand the sort of constraints to buyers being willing to pay more would be for credits that have a strong gender dimension, that it would be really valuable to get a better understanding of that. We need to. Recommendation 4. So this is about, I think I touched on this before in the findings, and these are some of the recommendations around the key players that can play an important role in establishing, integrating gender equality and women's empowerment into the global infrastructure. I'll quickly I've mentioned VCMI and ICVCM. Ratings agencies and other intermediaries a really important role to play in bringing together that interest between buyers and suppliers. And excuse me, Owen touched on Article 6, and again, one of the great things about Article 6 is that it establishes the principles of inclusive carbon markets, and it's explicit about women. It's explicit about social links between the carbon markets and sustainable development goals. So there's great opportunities in there to really sort of push forward. And finally, I think the 5th recommendation, didn't want to miss this, about taking action at the national level. We didn't have a great amount of time to dig down here, but we did want to highlight the importance of the national level, since this is where increasingly voluntary carbon markets are going to be, the policy frameworks are going to be evolving now post the finalisation of the Article 6 rulebook. And so it's really important at this time to ensure that there's a bringing together of the climate folks, the carbon folks, and the gender folks, to make sure that gender is fully integrated into those frameworks. I will better wrap up there to leave space for our panelists and for Q&A, but hand over to Russell, who I think has some questions.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks for that run through of the report, and we have posted the links to the 3 volumes that make up the report onto the chat box. So please do download those documents and read them in your own time. We're very shortly going to move into the panel discussion, but before we did that, we wanted to ask again the audience a couple of questions relating to VCM and gender in particular, and if Hudson will put up the 2 questions in the polling window as you had before. Again, both questions are there. Please do provide us the answer to the question you think is most relevant to you, and then print and then hit submit. I'm just interested to see the answers to those questions as they come up. And I say, once this poll is finished, and we'll let it run for about a minute, we will then move into the panel discussion. So we have 3 panelists from across the voluntary carbon market ecosystem to give us their views of the subject today. And then again, if there are some questions you have for either Sue or the panelists, please do put them in the chat. Although we're running a little behind time, I suspect we'll have a little bit of time to ask a couple of questions to either the panelists or to Sue. So please do post any questions you have in the chat when you get to that point. So we're going to say let the poll run for another few seconds, and then we will move into the panel discussion. Just bear with us one moment. So Hudson, I think you can shut the poll now, and then we can go to the move on to the next stage of this afternoon. So again, interestingly, a good spread of answers to that question. Again, it's useful to get that feedback from the audience in relation to some of those issues. So thank you for those comments. So as I said, we will now move into the into the panel discussion, and we're joined by three experts from across the ecosystem of voluntary carbon markets. I'll ask them to join me now for the panel discussion. You can see their names on the screen, and what we'll do is I will introduce each of them briefly in turn, and then get them to provide their initial responses to the report and what Sue has presented. So we're going to start with, sorry, excuse me. We're going to start with Anna from Wildlife Works. She's the Global Climate Policy Director at Wildlife Works, and we've asked her to come and present the perspective of the supply side of the market. I'll let Anna provide any further introduction she would like to herself, and then perhaps you can give us a couple of minutes on, say, your response to the findings and recommendations in the report from your perspective, and what actors in your part of the market need to do to move forward on gender integration in the VCM. So Anna, looking forward to your couple of minutes responses.
Thank you, Russell, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm Global Climate Policy Director with Wildlife Works. We are a REDD+ developer, so my focus is really on nature-based solutions here. By background, I'm an agricultural engineer, actually, then went on to work in finance, and now in the policy field. I've been in the carbon market from what feels like the beginning for over 20 years, and I need to say I'm not a gender expert. The only thing that qualifies me to speak here, I guess, is a woman in business who's just sort of bolstered through. And I certainly see a shift in, over the past decades in terms of where women are in the market. But I was shocked actually to hear the results. The main finding is that the voluntary carbon market is still lagging behind compared to the other development sector. I come out of the development space actually, so before developing carbon projects, I was a field economist alongside public development programs, and so trained in some of those socioeconomic techniques. And still until today, even with our team in the company, I'm quite shocked sometimes how little we pick up development tools that are out there. That might be fueled by the competition that we see in the voluntary market, where donor programs are, in some cases, in our cases of avoided deforestation, sort of at the brink of crowding us out of the market. So there is a bit of a competition, I would say, which shouldn't really be the case. I feel there should be more collaboration and inspiration. But in terms of so sort of the main recommendations, they really resonate with me. And in terms of the democratization of the voluntary carbon market, that we're actually far away from that, even from the carbon market, to even be accessible to local communities or groups on the ground, smaller companies even in the global south. So it's not a gender issue, but it gives us, I think, an idea of really the barrier that we have to break here to even get to the level of creating access for women, because we don't have access. Small companies, small project developers literally don't exist. Carbon development methodologies are usually complex. The whole process is super complex. So in our work for Wildlife Works, we work with indigenous groups and local communities in our conservation sites. They are the project owners. We never buy any land. They're the main stakeholders. And sort of the development process, it takes a long time, and the FPIC process, so getting free, prior and informed consent. And that's for us where literally sort of bringing in a gender lens starts, making sure that women are, part of the conversation. And that's tricky because we work in environments where we as Northerners, Westerners, need to respect local traditions and cultures. Yet we come in often into those places and women are not equally represented, and they don't have same access to any resources or power. So we're sort of balancing this act of trying to also bring innovation at a very local cultural level, and I think this is where, the voluntary market is just, struggling with all the problems that the real economy has. But what we try to do here, and one initiative that Wildlife Works did, is we co-created the People's Forests Partnership. It's an organization that brings together Indigenous people and companies, and to sort of explore and really find out how equal investment partnerships can look like. And that is now a way for us to inspire, on the one hand, the demand side, but also the supply side. So communities, we can now sort of go back to some of the leaders in the communities and say, well, gender is really important, and they actually know this. It's just some of the structures aren't, culture is a moving concept, right? So it constantly changes, but now the creating direct access to Indigenous communities also sort of increases the willingness to have conversations around inclusiveness and benefit distribution at a local and project level. And that is what we're trying to inspire as gentle as we can, but also in some of our projects, the women are actually extremely outspoken and confident. And in other projects, not so much. I mean, we're dealing with a whole spectrum here, but just one more, I'll shut there. But just one more comment. I feel, it's also, but really it comes back to learning at a developer's level. So even with my company and even with our teams here, we've got great guys, and it's mostly men in the field. We got to say, well, we're trying to balance that as well, just hiring women as much as we can, but increasing that awareness and making sure that they understand that just because women are in the room, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily being heard. In some cases, they speak different languages, so we need to have different translators, or they wouldn't speak up with men in the room, so we need to literally take them out and adjust sort of our FPIC processes, our participatory planning processes to that. And that's where we need way more guidance, and I think awareness and hopefully standards can play a role. I totally agree with Sue. They don't so far. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for that. Those insights. We'll move swiftly on to hear from our second panelist, who is Rachel Vertegard, who's the CEO from a brokerage firm, Empower Co, and she's going to provide a perspective from the demand side of the market. I mean, similarly, Rachel, interested in sort of your views on your initial response to the findings and recommendations in the report, but also, what your view is of sort of what the actors in your part of the market need to do to move forward on gender integration, the voluntary carbon market. So, Rachel, looking forward to your remarks. You're on mute, Rachel.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Russell. I am the founder and CEO of Empower Co, and we are building the first ever global voluntary market for women's empowerment units. I come from this work after beginning in carbon project development, primarily REDD+ projects since 2011. I was actually with Wildlife Works for many years, so appreciate the work that Anna and others are continuing to do there. And what I saw firsthand from doing that work and actually developing, being on the front lines of developing the market for REDD+ voluntary carbon units was first a denial by most corporates of wanting to really look at, measure, and address their carbon footprints. And then an acceptance that they needed to, and that came primarily because it was finally possible for them to look at not only the many emerging ways that they could reduce their absolute emissions, but have something to address their so far unavoidable emissions in a tangible way, which is the VCM as we know it today. So it's incredible to see that grow. And I think that is becoming more nuanced as this report shows. It's also becoming fraught with unintended consequences, especially for women in many of these communities who companies who are participating in purchasing credits from projects actually want to be supporting. And so in terms of the report, I just hats off to the team. I of course contributed to it, but had such a minor role compared to Sue and her team and the dedication that they've had to this. And I think that one thing that I think is incredibly important as we value the gender lens in this marketplace is we recognize that we're not just doing this because it's a trend or something that sounds nice to do in a company's impact report. We're doing this, as this report so adequately shows, because it's actually a de-risking activity for the entire VCM. So this is a business imperative. It's not just a feel-good initiative. And clearly the gap in finance does not reflect that currently. And as we do that, as we start to fill in that gap, and as we start to incorporate gender more into the voluntary carbon market, and more generally understand a critical link between gender and climate mitigation and adaptation, we have to be utilizing metrics and mechanisms that are robust and that are tried and true and tested in the field with women, that come from a place of actually being in service to women, that come from a place where they're generated by women, and that we don't have standards and methodologies that are too far on the spectrum of being created by academia and then being kind of imposed upon communities, but rather have these initiatives come through communities. And an excellent example of that is the W+ standard. It robustly and transparently quantifies women's empowerment. And at EmpowerCo, we actually represent exclusively all of the certified W+ projects in the world that have units of women's empowerment that are tradable assets that are available on the market registry, just like carbon offsets are. And that lends itself, which is just an awesome development, for carbon labeled with W+. And there are multiple carbon project developers who are in the process of doing this, having a VCU, voluntary carbon unit, that has the W+ label on it, including Wildlife Works, including an all-female-led agroforestry team in Brazil, and a number of others. And so it's very important, I think, that as we move this agenda forward, and we do begin to incorporate gender more into these conversations and into the financing and into the structure and capacity building of these projects, that we ensure that we're being aware of unintended consequences, and that we do not make this a pink flag waving exercise of any kind. That the initiatives, the methodologies, the standards that are utilized to begin to meaningfully measure women's impact in this space and value it is robust and can work for everyone. And then the last thing I'll say, just on the demand side, is I have been in conversation with over 50 Fortune 500 companies since my company launched in late March of this year. And when I used to work in the Red Plus space, I was so used to hearing no every day, multiple times a day. I had the door slammed in my face more times than I can count when we were trying to get this market going. With getting this market going around valuing women and their inherent power to support things like the VCM and all of the SDGs, what I'm finding is no one has said no yet, which is incredibly frustrating on the one hand, because I'd love to hone my focus. And on the other hand, it is illuminating to the fact that corporates more and more and more every day, and large financial institutions are looking at how they quantifiably measure their impact, their social impacts more broadly, but especially those as they relate to gender, and specifically those that are at the nexus of gender and climate. So I'm very emboldened by that. I'm very hopeful with the conversations that I'm having, and I'm looking forward to continuing to be a part of this conversation and this movement to to ensure that we integrate women across the board and elevate them so that we can have a thriving and sustainable future for the voluntary carbon market.
Thanks, Rachel, for those useful insights from your point of view in the market. We'll move swiftly on to the final, the third person who's going to speak today, which is Genevieve So from Climate Impact X. She's going to provide her views from the perspective of an intermediary in the market. And again, looking for you, Genevieve, to give your initial comments, reflections on the findings of the report, and then we know what's the role of intermediaries in promoting or continuing to drive the gender agenda forward, if you like. If you can hear from you first, and I do have a few questions going to ask the panelists at the end. We're a bit behind time, but I suspect we're looking to wrap up about 5 past the hour. So Genevieve, looking to hearing from you, and then I've got a few questions to ask all the panelists at the end. So please go ahead, Genevieve.
Thanks so much, Russell. First off, congratulations to the team on the publishing of the paper. I think it does bring to light and forward the thinking around how to think about gender as part of the VCM. I think both the prior panelists have already talked about what this means from a supply and a demand angle. So a quick intro about what I do here at CIX. So I'm Genevieve, so I'm the head of platforms and ecosystems here at CIX. What that means is we design the venues in which participants, buyers, sellers, traders access carbon credits around the world. And in that role, when I address a topic like gender, I'll be the first to admit that one of the struggles we have is how do we showcase gender as an important criteria in credit selection? And the second is, as an exchange and a marketplace, how do we articulate the associated premiums for the work that has been done to really benefit the women associated with these projects? So I think the recommendations here within this report already start to address this by articulating the need to highlight the metrics associated with gender benefits, but also that we should be rewarding the work that goes into some of these things. So with the hat of CIX on, I think it'd be great for us to be able to showcase projects with very clear labeling, whether or not this is coming from work coming out of the standards or even guidance of bodies like the VCMI, to articulate which projects have done an outsized effort in being able to bring gender to the fore, and fully agree with what Rachel said, that this is not purely a co-benefit. In fact, being able to plan with women communities in mind, in some situations, very clearly adds to the quality of the carbon permanence as well. So I think the jury has already come back to us. There are companies out there willing to pay for and support projects that do benefit local women communities. We just need to be able to showcase that and ideally be able to price that in and discover that premium associated with such efforts. I'll just stop there. I got Russell's little wink about timing. That's the questions. I'm happy to answer anything else.
Thank you, Genevieve. That was really good. Thanks for that. So, as I indicated at the start of your comments, I have got a couple of questions to ask the panelists. So, including one for Sue, because given we're close to time, I'll move straight on to ask. I have one question for each of you, but perhaps I can start with Sue. And there's a question around. Basically say, is there any specific percentage of benefit sharing allocation for women activities on the carbon market?
That's a good question,
Sue?
Yeah, I'll be very interested if the other the panelists have sort of views on this. Yeah, I mean, look, The only one that I'm aware of at the moment is like with the W plus that Rachel has already mentioned, where there's a requirement of a minimum of 20% of the proceeds to go to women's organizations. But so that's a starting point. But I would also say, I mean, for me, the answer is 50-50. That's what equitable benefit sharing means. And that should be a target. But to thank Anna for raising this question about, it's hard enough getting, that benefit sharing going to communities. So it's very much, I think, part of that process of shifting the dial towards recognition of the fair sharing of benefits means a fair share going to the local community. And as part of that, then I would obviously advocate for 50%. But good to hear other people's thoughts on that too.
Thanks, Sue. I'll bring in some of the other panelists in a moment. Just to say to the audience, while we're going through the Q&A, we are going to flash up some final questions we'd like you to answer. If you can do that whilst you're listening to the Q&A, and as I said, I suspect we'll let the Q&A run for about another sort of 5 minutes to finish 5 past the hour. So I know that we were scheduled to finish at say 9 o'clock UK time, 6 p.m. here, but I think we'll let it run on for a little bit longer, say potentially about 5 more minutes or 5 past the hour, so we can get some insights from the panelists. I was going to turn to Rachel. I mean, obviously, any comments on the question that Sue answered, but also a question around how do you translate the demand for gender credits into improving women's lives on the ground? So that was for Rachel.
Yeah. Well, you translate it by ensuring, as Sue said, that there is a transparent distribution of benefits that directly benefits them. So as Sue said, a requirement of the W plus standard is 20% of all proceeds go directly back to women, and there's no requirement on how they spend that. At EmpowerCo, we actually have a 50% requirement for all of the projects we represent. What is interesting is so far with the sales that have been done of W plus units prior to my launching the company, what has been found is that most women used those funds towards climate adaptation efforts, which just further highlights the way that they respond and how they care for their communities and the planet when they're given any kind of leadership, benefit, financial resources, etc. And so I think that it's very important for the demand to be clear, that what they're purchasing and how they're supporting projects and the indicators of that have very transparent and clear ways in which they're structured to ensure that funds are flowing not just to the project developer to delegate to women, but are flowing in some capacity directly to women. That is the most empowering thing that we can ultimately do.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Rachel. Just to highlight to the audience that we have now put up the final polling questions. You should be able to see those on your screen. So please do answer those questions as we go through the final parts of the Q&A. I was going to turn to Genevieve next and ask a question related to co-benefit. And the question is around how do we move from gender as a co-benefit to reporting on what the co-benefit actually is? So Genevieve, interested in your views on that question.
I probably start from taking a step back to say that most co-benefits today report at the UNSDG blank number level. They keep it at the logo level, and there's no consistent way to describe the activities that are going on beyond that tag. I think of all the standards, gold standard actually has gone the furthest to start to codify and articulate what exactly the underlying activities look like. It's less explicit with some of the other registries today. I think the struggle with most co-benefits, not just the one on gender equity, is really around the fact that there's no single unit metric that's hyper comparable. But I do think by elevating some of these underlying metrics, we'll start to see more harmonization, or at least an understanding of what are you actually creating on ground that is benefiting local communities. So at the very least, we see standards including this as a codified field that people can easily search and understand. But I think over time, what we'd love to be able to see is that sort of information be available across all projects in a consistent manner. And similar with the work that W Plus is doing, it could very well be a situation where, as a co-benefit, it's hard to really dig into the weeds for the average corporate buyer. And so having a label like the W Plus is also helpful, because then you know there's been an increased level of scrutiny, or at least a specific focus on the topics such as gender and additional type of auditing done. I'm not sure if Rachel quite covered this, but in conversation with Jeanette and the team at Woken, my understanding is there are not many auditors who can actually certify W Plus today. So it's also a muscle or a capacity that we have to build so that people understand what's going on and why that it should be valued. At the highest of levels also, I think beyond thinking about gender as a co-benefit to carbon, I think it warrants the market to think about gender as a benefit on its own. I think the idea of co-benefit assumes that it's an additional externality, that there's a tag along to carbon. I mean, in this forum specifically, I think we should really think about it as a core benefit on its own, right? And so creating an articulation around why companies should be supporting credits that do this sort of work, I think actually goes back to helping them understand what sort of claims they can make. Because at the end of the day, they're also trying to do the right things, but they sometimes get hamstrung by reporting guidance that doesn't quite give them the checkbox where they need it. So if you're the CSO or the person trying to drive this initiative and you're going to the Treasury office saying, hey, I need X amount of dollars to want to support this, the question that comes back is, great, so what's that going to do to my ESG score, for example, right? And that link just isn't there. So I think creating some of those links to justify that demand signal can help the market move faster. So it's a little bit of a roundabout way to say, yes, more transparency around the co-benefits help, but could we move beyond a co-benefit to an outright benefit in and of itself?
Thank you, Genevieve. And one final question for Anna. So, Anna, from your perspective as a project developer, what do you see as the key barriers to integrating gender, and what do you see as needed to overcome these barriers?
Wow, there's several. I just want to say, really echo, I love what Genevieve was saying, and you know, a key barrier is we actually don't have means to really measure and show gender impact on the ground. You know, auditors are just not available, they're not sufficiently trained. That relates to a whole, you know, the whole suite of sustainable development impacts, I would say, plus carbon impacts actually. So auditors, we really need to get going in that field. But you know, direct access to finance is something we easily say, but it's actually quite hard because women per se are not, you know, always organized in women's groups and have bank accounts, you know, and can actually sort of receive that money. So I think what we need to really be thinking through, maybe for us here in this new task force that we're forming here, is to explore what are, you know, benefit sharing models that we can then use, and or sort of those structures, because I'm
Cool.
Sorry, that's the builders here. So, you know, creating direct access to finance, I think, it's hard, but making sure women investment plans are part of the overall investment structure. And we don't talk of benefit sharing actually at Wildlife Works. We speak of revenue sharing, because quite often, you know, they own those projects. They're key stakeholders. They're not beneficiaries, right? So making sure also in the contract structures that they are being built in. We like to think of those owners of projects to receive 60 to 70% of the revenues. That depends, you know, on government regulation at times. So I think really reaching out to governments, getting their social safeguard system in shapes. They're all lagging behind in that regard, but also getting the gender lens in there is absolutely critical. And really helping with tools, I think, on the ground. We need a lot of more tools to help in the planning process. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks all to the panelists. I mean, we have now run over time, so I think we are going to have to close the webinar now this afternoon. In doing that, I would obviously just like to thank firstly the three panelists. So thanks to Anna, Rachel and Genevieve for their inputs this afternoon. I've certainly learned more about the issue than I did before we started, and I do hope those in the audience have found it helpful. And obviously, thanks to Sue for presenting this afternoon on the findings of the report, but also on doing a large part of the lead work in preparing the report alongside Olivia and Smita. And obviously then thank you all to the audience for joining. I do hope you found it useful. You've obviously got the links to the reports in the chat box. We will be getting back to you shortly around circulating the video of this event so that you can actually listen and look at it again in your own time. And then please do reach out to any member of the team if you would like to follow up in terms of any questions you didn't get to ask or anything you wanted to know more about in relation to this issue. But say, given that it's now approaching 10 past the hour, we do need, I'm afraid, to wrap up. So thanks everybody for joining. Have a good rest of day and rest of week.